you everybody for coming today. Sadly, this is our last lecture until probably next February, but we will start a new series then. So if anybody has any suggestions or ideas for one of our lecture series, please let me know. And having said all of that, I would like you to join me in welcoming our good friend Ella Leffland back to Martinez. Ella.
I don't know if I need this.
Oh, yes.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Is it as I should have it? Right here?
There's not.
Have it closer to your mouth.
Okay.
Is it on? Is it on?
Yeah.
Andrew, just Andrew, there's,
Oh, yes. Is there a hum?
That's good.
It's good.
Yeah. No,
I'll just keep it like this then. I sound like three people to myself. Anyway, it's really nice to be here in Martinez again and to see what a very nice turnout. It's very heartening. And I am, of course, to talk about Martinez of old, when I was growing up in it, during the war, during the time I wrote Rose of Peace, which covered, 1941 to 1945. And so I'm trying to recall how things were and how they differed from the way things are today. But I would also like to say this: I am not a good speaker. I'm not what you would call somebody who was born to it. And therefore, I would never be able to talk for half an hour or an hour at a time. And that's why I would like, if any of you have any questions, that you would please ask them, because then we can kind of take it on from there like a basketball game. Yes, there's one right up there.
I was very excited to see when you turned on to becoming a student. You were not an eager student in the beginning of the book. What turned you on?
Well, what did turn me on? No, I really hated studying. I think it was when I met the genius, and I got the idea that there really were things to know, to learn, and to understand. And then it was something like the flower of knowledge, as she described it. You learn one thing and it leads into something else, and that leads on and on. It became exciting at last to do something like that. I had some very good teachers too, which helped a lot.
A very good mind also.
Oh, well, I was always a very poor student though. But that covered the period of the junior high school years mainly, and then also down where you have your fire department now was where I went to grammar school. In the there's a big, well, it was the boys and girls club, I think, and that's still there, isn't it? No, it is still there. That's right. It was on the corner. That was the playground on the corner. And so I went to kindergarten and then to the where they now have the civic center, and that was our early elementary school grades there, and then on to the 6th grade and so forth and so on. Yes?
Can you tell us about your early life here, your parents and what your dad did and so forth?
Yeah, my parents came here the year before I was born, they came here in 1930. And they moved up by the Shell tanks on Warren Street, the end of Warren Street. And we lived there until I was 4 years old. And my dad had a job as an automobile painter in the body shop, which is now, you have to tell me where that is again.
Ferry.
It was on Ferry Street and
Where the Opera Theater.
the Opera Theater.
Not the Opera Theater, the Opera Theater.
Yeah, there. I didn't even know that there was such a thing as an opera in Martinez. Evidently there has been in recent years. So he worked there, and then when the war started, he commuted to Oakland and worked at the shipyards down in Oakland.
So how did he commute to Oakland? What was the transportation from here to Oakland at the time?
He had his car. He had an old Model A Ford. See, because they were given special oil rations because they were necessary workers. But if you didn't have that, you couldn't drive very far at all. Everything was rationed. So he drove down there. And but the main thing I've noticed, I drove around, was driven around Martinez today. I haven't been back here for any length of time to really see the city by daytime. The town, I should say, by daytime. What seems different now is that it's, although I wouldn't call it a heavily trafficked city, it's just, there is more traffic than there was when I grew up. Hardly ever did you see a few cars, up and down the streets and so forth. But you didn't see cars parked at great rates up and down the streets where people had parked to go shopping or, to go into stores and things like that. It was mostly, there were just fewer cars. That was a big change. And then also it was a very quiet town. And I suppose it still is. Pretty quiet. It's not like many parts of Contra Costa County, which are like great big shopping malls. And I think that's the great attraction of Martinez, that it has kept its character, despite a lot of attempts to change it, and there have been some changes. But it has kept the character of a town, a real town, with a heart, and a circulatory system and all that, as apart from something that's just part of another great big counties spreading out all over. So, I told you, yes?
Where was Peggy's house?
That was on Pacheco Boulevard. When you go down Pacheco this way, and then there's the Congregational Church just up the block, and then you go around like that, right there. That's about the best I can say. Where it makes that kind of an S.
It's like Susanna and Alhambra? Pacheco,
Susanna. Yeah, it could be. It could have been right there. Yeah. Right there. And it wasn't as elaborate or as impressive as it was in the book. But it was a very nice house. Very cozy house. And not quite as peculiar as it was in the book, because the book was, in good part, autobiographical, but then again it was also fictional. So many things were, you might say, a little bit exaggerated or changed, or simply imagined, whereas much of it really was based, and some of it was based on actual people. For instance, Mr. Kerr, I think, was the name of the music teacher, high school music teacher in the book, and his name was Mr. Call, K-A-U-L, and he was exactly as he was in the book. He was a wonderful, true character, an individual. I had a kind of continental flair about him, which was really exotic, because you never met anybody who was continental. He actually wore shoes that looked as if they had been made in Tahiti or something. That was so exciting, very exciting. Did somebody raise a hand? No. Yes?
Well, I'll ask for those probably very few people in the room who have not read Rumors of Peace that all the questions are referring to. And even for those of us who have, what was the motivation for you to write it, and what was the process used to put it all together?
The motivation was this, that the war for some reason did terrify me. I mean, more than most people, I think. I don't know what it was, but it really did. It made such an impression on me, and I always had wanted to write a short story about sitting down there in the cellar one night when there was an air raid warning. And so I put that aside. I did other things. But then one day I did sit down and tried to write it, and I realized that it just wouldn't stay within the boundaries of a short story. There was so much there. And I said, but if I write it, who's going to want to read a book from the point of view of a 10, 11, 12-year-old girl? And that bothered me all the time I wrote the book. I wasn't sure. But then it really became it was a problem, of course. Writing any kind of book is always a big problem. But it became a joy, too, to resurrect so much from the past. Then I came over here and I went to the Gazette, down into their cellar where they had all the back issues of the old newspapers, looked through all of those and got a lot more information from them and talked to old friends and, of course, my own family, too. And did all that. But it did take a good long time. And then when I finally did finish it, and I sent the manuscript to my agent, and she sent it to an editor, and he said, well, he really, really liked it, except for one thing. There's one character in there who was too outrageous. He simply could not believe her. And so he told me which character that was. That was Helen Maria. And I said, but that's how she was. And he said, I'm sorry, you really will have to remove some of these passages. And so I did. Helen Maria was a lot more outrageous in person than she was in the book. Anyway, the book had a very good reception. I was pleased about that. Yes?
What were, if you can recall, what were a couple of the passages that you removed about Helen Maria? I love her.
Well, there was one that my brother remembers well. He was actually about the same age. In the book, I had him a little bit older, I think. But and she did actually have a semester or so at Alhambra High. And she went up the stairs one day, and Bill was on duty. What do they call him?
Hall monitor.
Yeah, hall monitor or something like that. And she was, I don't know what she was doing. She was walking too fast or, I don't know, doing something. And he said, you can't do that. You have to walk the same way as everybody else. And she just slapped him across his face. Hard as she could. He knocked him off his feet. And so that was one of the things he said, no, that, she didn't be like that. I said, well, she was. That was, so I left that out. And I'm trying to think, there were others, but I think of them all.
That does remind me, what in real life ever happened to Helen Marie?
Helen Maria in real life did manage to get to Oxford. And in the book she was interested in Greek archaeology, but in real life it was Egyptology that she was interested in. And she got some, advanced degree at Oxford, and she did do some excavations in Egypt. All this I knew secondhand because her family had moved away from Martinez, and I wasn't in touch with them anymore. And yes, she did that, and there again, my brother visited her in Oxford, and he said he went into the, where she was living in some sort of a, I don't know what it was, not a dormitory, but something like that. And we sat and we talked for a while. And she seemed very happy to see him, and she was telling him everything about her studies and so forth, and everything, and how glad she was to see him and so forth, and then forgot all about him and kept talking about herself. And then when he was leaving, she said, well, goodbye, Jack. And he said, no, my name isn't Jack, it's Bill. So I had no idea who he was from the beginning. That's how she was, very absent-minded. And then, I don't know, I heard that she had died very young, and nobody knew what was behind it, if it was suicide or Some people thought the CIA was behind it, but that might have been a little bit far out. I really don't know because I lost touch, but she was the most interesting person. Yes?
Well, I'm interested to hear you say that you weren't sure how it would be received with the be through the eyes of a young girl, because the reason I love it so much is that I didn't go through exactly what you went through because I was a little younger, but I was certainly very well aware of what was going on and the fears that you mentioned. And my family was living in Palo Alto, and I remember when Port Chicago ran, because it was heard all over the whole region. And the fear of that, and particularly at first people were thinking it might be the Japanese that were done.
That was the first
And
assumption,
yeah, so I recognized a lot of what you wrote about, of what the girl went through in her feelings about the war and everything. I do have a question. You obviously used the number of people that you knew in Martinez as the basis for characters.
Mm-hmm.
Did any of them come to you later and complain?
Yes. But only many, many years later, and only one. And that was the Peggy in the book. Yeah. I always felt badly that afterwards. In fact, I think if I really thought twice, I wouldn't have written the book in the first place, because it's not fair to use real people as, well, I wouldn't say models, but yeah, very close models or characters, because you're bound to say things about them that aren't nice, and it simply shouldn't be done. That's why I didn't say much about my own. I don't mean I'd ever say anything not nice about my own family, but I didn't want it to be a family story in which all my parents, my sister and brother, and all our relationship took on absolute reality. That's a memoir, but that's not what I would think of as a novel, so I left a lot of that out. But in any case, Peggy, whom I described in terms of great superficiality on top of other things, she did say afterwards, I met her through another friend, it has to be about maybe 16, 17 years ago, and she said, I don't know you'd write all that. I hardly even knew you. I said, well, that's not true. And then she just said she said, I remember so-and-so and so-and-so very well, whatever became of them. And she acted as if that everything I had written was imagined, entirely imagined, and it wasn't. And she had become very, very religious. Well, it's neither here nor there, except that she wasn't when I knew her. Yeah, she changed a great deal. But that was the only one. Mario, little Mario, the one who was, what would you call him? Well, I guess he had Down syndrome or something like that. And he did die at the age of 17. He was definitely a very real person, so was his brother. But there was nothing said about them that I'd ever retract, because they were wonderful little people. Trying to think of other people. Some of the teachers, well, Mr. Cole was based very much on the real, and his wife too.
Mr. Lewis?
Mr. Lewis, that was Mr. Christian. Yes. I mean, that's how I interpreted him. I think he's probably a very nice person. Always wore a gray suit, though, I remember that. And I don't know who else was there. Yes?
The parts about the sheriffs who were kind of, at that time during the war, everyone looked to the sheriff for protection, and the sheriffs were out there in the river guarding us from the sabotage that might come from the Japanese Navy or whatever. I found that fascinating. When I first came to Martinez, John D. Miller was the sheriff. And of course, before that, I think it was Veal.
Veal was,
Right.
was,
And they were interesting, colorful characters.
yeah.
And I think you brought that out very well, coupling that with the fact that everyone at that time was afraid because of the refineries in
Oh.
the river and the war. And
Oh.
living in Concord when I was small, we didn't pick that feeling up.
Quite as
When we
much,
came
maybe.
over here, it was very real.
Yes, very, very strong. We had right across the bay, we had the, what do you call it, the arsenal, yeah, and then of course, Port Chicago, not Port Costa, Port Chicago, and then your island, and Shell Oil, Standard Oil, every other oil company, all, and Martinez was right in the middle of it. So there was good reason to be scared. And I think it was, I was saying earlier to you, I think, that it was Veal, but it wasn't Veal, he was much earlier, it was John Miller, I think, Johnny Miller, who was at that time the sheriff. Yeah, and then there was he always was on a motorcycle, really nice looking fellow. What was his name? You know, everybody knows him.
Nicola?
Yeah, Nicola, Roy Nicola.
He was the police chief.
He was the police chief, yes. He was on December 7th, boy, he was roaring around that town. Everybody, well, nobody really knew what was going to happen. So it was on the map, just as it is now with the Beatles.
Ella, did you use any kind of journals, or did you write any kind of journals? Anything to help you besides just oral history and reading old newspapers?
And yeah, that was all. I did write, I had a diary, but very little in it from that time. Mostly what I could remember, and then with my family. And what we talked, you talk in a family, you talk about things years after, and as time goes on, we keep talking about them, so they became pretty well etched into my memory. But no, I didn't have anything like a journal. I wish I had. At that age, I used to do, well, the most you might do is to keep a little diary of some sort. All I remember is on the last day of the war, I still have that page too. I said today is the last day of the war. It was the VJ Day, August 15th, 1945. Somebody else? Yeah?
I was loaned your book years ago, so I don't remember some certain details. But I was wondering in what order this book was. Was this your first book? And,
No, it was the third.
oh, so you were quite a bit older when you wrote.
Yeah.
You still lived in Martinez?
No, I live in San Francisco. I think it came out in 1979. Yeah, so I would have been in my 40s. And I had written Mrs. Monk, which takes place in Port Costa. And then about a season which took place in San Francisco. Yes?
Mrs. Monk stayed with me for years after I read it. It was one of my all-time favorites.
Thank you. Ah, thank you.
Would there be a time that you could come and talk to us about the motivation and background? Wonderful story.
Yeah, I wonder about the motivation in that book, to be quite honest. a lot of seething feelings. Yes.
Not based on a relationship with anyone?
Excuse me?
Feelings not based on a relationship that you were aware of or you were?
Well, I'll leave that up in the air.
The night of the Port Chicago explosion, you were away from your family, according to the book. Is that quite accurate, or is that fictional?
That is accurate, but it was in Lafayette.
Or
It was in Lafayette.
You ran home.
That is not true.
Tell us about that, please.
Yeah, as I really, really wanted to. I was just beside myself. But, and when the rest of the people I was there with me, they went to bed, and I did sneak outside, and I went down to the highway there. It was so filled with police cars and ambulances and fire trucks and everything, and the sirens and the motors. It just terrified me. So I turned around and walked back. So I didn't do what I did in the book. That's what I would have liked to do. But what was absolutely true was that we were his friends, they were twins, girls, the Newlanders, they lived out there, they were friends of my parents. And we did sleep out on this roof. And we were lying there, and all of a sudden, I did talk about this at where were you anyway? What were that? At that other time. But anyway, all of a sudden, the sky just turned orange, pale orange, but there was no sound, and we could see things going like this and this around in it. And I remember my friend said, it's the end of the world. And then all of a sudden, there was this tremendous crash, and we, rushed inside. That was when the sound had traveled to us after the explosion. And those turned out to be the fragments of the ships that were going around and around in that terrible kind of bloom of rose. And that was 7 miles away, so I can imagine what it would have been looking at it from here, from Martinez, which is what, 4 miles maybe? Are there any of you who, I know that you remember, where are you? Yes, that you remember the night, but you were too small to remember much of anything else. Nobody here remembers, huh?
Did your home where you were raised, did it suffer any damage from that?
My home?
Yes?
No, my house on Pastor Street didn't, and yet just a block or two away, the windows are caved in, and then you go this way and they were caved in, and then you have these blocks where everything was intact. It was as if the waves came in waves, very odd. Not everything was broken, but I understand that Main Street was just a monstrous mess. All the plate glass windows had been knocked out, and produce lying all over the street, and a lot of looting going on and that sort of thing. No, it's pretty nice.
On the night of the explosion, I was ironing.
Oh,
And first, when I felt the explosion, I thought my water heater was blowing out. But then it was my front door was blown in. And the only thing that saved, I lived on Shell Avenue, and the only thing that saved me was the hill across the street. It took the blunt of my front door came right off.
Shell Avenue. Yeah, that was even closer than the rest of the town was. It was the worst military disaster of the Second World War. Surely there must be more questions.
Well, you've written a number of novels, all of them on very different themes and settings.
Yes.
Suspense to breath and shadows and all in between. Can you talk something about what causes you to pick a subject for any of your novels, all of them? What was the motivation or interest?
It's hard to say.
Well, take the one about roaring.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because in a way that was engendered by Rumors of Peace. That was the next one.
What's the title?
The Night, Death, and the Devil. It was a novel based on the life of Hermann Goering. Very long, 700 pages, but after I finished Rumors of Peace, I'd always been interested in the war, but it had rekindled a lot of my interest. Started reading a lot more about the Second World War, and became really involved in those books and that kind of research. And Goering was of special interest for various reasons, partly because he was they were all hard to figure out, but he was hard to figure out. You couldn't call him a Nazi insofar as he represented the officer class more than he did the Nazi party. And yet, he allowed himself to be twisted into all of that, and that's what interested me, the contradictions in his character. And also the period itself, just fantastic and horrible era. And then after that, Red in Shadows, well, I don't know. There had been a loss in my family, and that led me to think along those lines. In the case of several of the people in that novel. And there's always some personal reason, I think, behind the subjects that you choose to write about. But Rumors of Peace, yeah, that came about because I'd always wanted to write about it. And then finally sat down and did. Yeah.
Are you going to talk about the process that you went through to write The Night, Death, and Devil?
What process was that?
Well, you learned the language you went through?
Oh,
I mean, that's
yeah.
very interesting.
After I decided I'm really going to write about this, I didn't know German, and so I took a class at a night school, junior high school, night school. I mean, held in the junior high school in San Francisco, the Marina School. Took a class in German so that I would at least be able to talk conversationally when I went to Germany. Talk conversationally, and also be able to read. Maybe not fluently, because you can't really learn German in a short period of time. It was a year's course, but even so. So I did definitely want to do that, and then of course I read a great deal. And I got records of old German, actually things that had been recorded by the Nazi Party, things like that, you know. And then when I went to Germany, I was able to interview some of the really important people who played parts in the novel, like Albert Speer, who was the armaments minister, yeah, and Alfred Gallant, who was the head of the fighter plane contingent of the Luftwaffe, and then a nephew of Goering, and then Goering's personal bodyguard. Gave me a lot of information. So that was really, really, really important, and also it gave you a sense of somehow there's a connection with the person you're writing about, which you wouldn't have had if you didn't talk to somebody who actually had spoken with him and knew him very well. But that took a lot of time and effort, and then there was a lot of just, plain research, reading. It took about 10 years to write with all that work, and then such a long book too, 700 pages. But quite different, I'll say, from the other books. So I don't know what the next one will be about. Maybe,
The Japanese internment, you talked a little bit about it. You had a great abhorrence for them after the attack.
I did,
But
yeah.
you also said that they came back before the war was over.
They did.
How was that explained, and how were they received?
Oh, they were, in great part, they were received with lots of suspicion and hatred. I think this was, trying to remember, it was toward the end of the war. That had to be the only reason that they would have released them, because by that time there was no possibility of the Japanese bombing us, and we'd beaten them that far back, even though the war was certainly not over yet. But originally the thought was that if there were any Japanese who were, in touch, like with the Japanese Navy or Air Force, that they could help bring them in to bomb the cities, and that by then that fear had evaporated. But even so, and they weren't all brought back at that time. I don't think they were, but a great number of them were. Oh, and there was, that was the time, I thought it was the time that one was beheaded in Seattle. And that may have been when the war broke out. Anyway, they were not welcomed back at all. A lot of deep feeling remained about the Japanese, yes?
No, I didn't quite find it that way. I went to school in Rio Vista. About a dozen or 15 of the Japanese students, they were high school age, came back and they were accepted pretty well.
Uh-huh. I'm glad to hear that. I went mostly because there weren't a lot in our area. So I went mostly by what I had read doing my research at that time. But in Rio Vista, yeah, well maybe they were. But during the war, didn't you feel that there was a lot of hatred for the Japanese during the war? But anyway, that those that came back were accepted. As they should have been, had nothing to do with it.
You conveyed a lot of connection to your brother, whom I guess was Bill, but in the book Peter, is that correct?
Yeah.
And he was in the European arena, and the angst that you had was very, very real. How did he make out with regard to his service?
Well, that was really fictionalized because Bill was drafted the last months of the war, and so he was never sent overseas.
Oh, well.
But I had friends whose brothers or fathers had been sent overseas and were in the war, and I can remember how they talked about their worries, and I remember one of them did say every time the doorbell rings, we think it's going to be a telegram, and that kind of thing. So there are a lot of personal experiences with people who had sons or brothers in the war, but I worried like anything all through the war that Bill was going to be drafted before he could, before he could get out of it. I wanted him to have flat feet and all those things so he wouldn't be drafted. But no, he was very lucky that he was drafted so late. Yes?
I remember something humorous, and like I said, it's been quite a while since I read the book, about the airway siren that being so loud.
Oh! Does anyone here remember that siren? It was a siren or something that goes, it wasn't. It was like a cow. Really loud. So loud. They actually said that babies would go into convulsions. and dogs and cats would dive into the bed. It was so loud. And so finally, it was lowered. And then, how was it? Oh, we were supposed to get a new one. Yeah, we were going to get a new one. And then that blew up when it was tested. That one blew up. And then finally, we did get another one. And I think that one was good. It was loud. The first one could be heard all the way over in Port Costa. And that's a good 7 miles away. But we needed a good loud one. Those first months at the beginning of the war, when everyone was so really quite sure that we were going to be bombed. I couldn't imagine how people could live from day to day thinking they were going to be bombed. But I don't know how those people in Europe withstood it for 6 years. But anyway, to go on from there.
So would you hear adults on the street always talking about the war? That their conversation kept feeding your fear as a child?
Oh, they didn't talk about it constantly, but they, and you'd get together with people, they would talk about it. And it was in the paper, God knows, every single day in the headlines. There was a good bit of talk about it, yeah. I had some friends in school whom I kept in touch with and asked about, and they said, well, yeah, of course the war was always around you, and you had friends whose brothers were in the war and so forth, and there was rationing and all that, but didn't really remember too much about it. So some did and some didn't. But yeah, I do think, no, but there again, a piece of fiction isn't the same as an actual straightforward memoir. And so certain things are emphasized, bring out, and I think I may have emphasized that more than it was true in real life. The discussions about the war.
Ella,
Yeah.
what are some of your memories of your life as a child in Martinez? What did you do for pleasure, entertainment? Tell us about some of those early memories.
Yeah, well, I lived across the street from the playground, because that was right next to where the big elementary school was. And so we could always run over there and swing on the swings and play on the rings and all that. That's where we spent a lot of time. Also in the Susanna Park, always were running over there and getting balled out by Hank the gardener. And just playing around there, and then also exploring in the creek. That was the big thing. It was against the rules. Never go into the creek, but yeah. And it did swell up in the winters. I can't remember it flooding the whole town year after year, but I'm sure it did. I mean, there were floods, that's for sure. I remember that we had a cellar, not the basement. It was actually a kind of cellar, but it had concrete. Part of the walls are concrete. And I remember my dad and my brother down there in rubber hip boots having to bail out the whole cellar, and the backyard was one great big pool of water. We lived only a block and a half from the creek. The creek was a big feature in the town. It lent a sense of mystery, I think, to the town, at least among kids. So there was that, and then also hiking up into the hills and sliding down on a piece of cardboard. You could do that, in the summer when everything was, it was like straw, like hay, and you could slide down there. And just hiking around those hills. And you couldn't walk down to the wharf by yourself, but you certainly could if there were several of you. You'd walk down there and sit around and just, look around at things and look at this ferry coming in and out. That was always exciting. It was much quieter, I think, than it is today. And you never had to worry, no child ever had to worry about, be sure to call me when you get down there. Get your cell phone, let me know if you got there safely and all that sort of thing. There was just no reason, nothing ever happened to anybody. Everybody knew everybody else. It was a very, very safe environment to grow up in. And a lovely environment. A beautiful little town. I really think it was an idyllic town to grow up in. Maybe it still is in many ways. So you asked about other entertainment. Well, going to the State Theater, friends and I would go to the State Theater where the serials, Saturday serials. There was usually Cowboys, and there was one that was Tarzan. Yeah. And when you'd see him last, he'd be to a big river of crocodiles, and then next time somehow you hadn't jumped yet, so everything turned out fine. Yeah, the State Theater was a very great sophisticated jewel in the town at that time. Big theater, and it just seemed so wonderful to have something so. What would you say? So, I don't know what the word would be. Cosmopolitan? Cosmopolitan, yes. And we had the Avon Theater too. But that didn't last too long. So we'd do that too. And other than that, there wasn't a great deal to do. But there always seemed to be something to do. I don't know, what do kids in Martinez do these days? Kids say 10, 12.
Lots of organized sports.
Organized sports, yeah. Yeah, maybe more organized sports in these days.
Do you remember, it's the 60th anniversary of the Martinez pool. In fact, we've got
Oh, yeah.
a profit measure on the ballot for a bond issue for money to help the library and rebuild the pool and really upgrade all the parks and so forth. It was a big fun community fundraising effort, and it opened in 1948. So just before you graduated from high school.
Yeah.
Do you remember that, or remember the pool or the fundraising?
I don't remember anything about it. It's funny, I loved to swim, but I never swam. Well, I went to college after that. I wasn't home. And then when I did, I think I tried to go there a couple of times, and it was so crowded that I couldn't really swim, so I didn't go. No, I don't know anything about that pool. And I find it hard to believe it's actually 60 years old. It seems to me it's very, very new. I guess it isn't.
Now, what about some of the other things, other careers that you had?
Oh.
Paperwork, that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I did work at this cannery a couple of summers when I was going to college, which was quite an education, I must say. And then in San Francisco, I had all kinds of odd jobs. And I worked on a Norwegian tramp steamer, 2 of them. They went up and down the coast, actually all the way down around the coast of South America. But I didn't stay on that long. I mean, all the way up to Canada. I forget the name of the river. Way, way, way up into Canada. I passed all these Indian reservations and everything.
Fraser River?
No, it wasn't the Fraser. I can't think of it. And they would stop at various mills and get the lumber aboard. That's what they were carrying. And then they came back down and came to San Francisco and down to San Pedro, and then on down to Mexico and so forth. But I can't remember what the reason was. I signed off that ship after a while. Well, really, because the work was so hard, my God. But then I signed on to another one a few months later, did the same thing. So that was very, very interesting. I got a good short story out of that. Yeah?
What did you do on the ship?
I was a mess girl. And also I cleaned all the cabins, the crew's cabins and the officers' cabins, and then brought the mess, and it was a mess, you know, all these trays up to the mess room, and then up to the officers' quarters, and then I scrubbed down the passageways, and boy, they got a lot of work out of you, I can tell you that. $60 a month. But board and room, I wouldn't have given it up for anything. It was really interesting. And I didn't get seasick either, so that was good. And so then in San Francisco, I had a lot of jobs, small jobs. Then I got a good job at it was the San Francisco legal newspaper, the Reporter. The Reporter. No, it's fun. It's the Recorder. The Recorder. What is that? The Recorder. I worked there for a while, and then I got at the Sun Reporter, which was the black newspaper in San Francisco. And I worked with them for a few years. And then by that time I had gotten Mrs. Monk accepted, so I quit and didn't go back to work that time. Yeah, and there are a lot of odd other jobs in between, you know, to keep body and soul together, which was necessary. Yeah, way back there?
What do you recall about like the arts and music community in Martinez? Like the arts and music community in Martinez when you were growing up here? Do you remember much?
No. Arts and music. I don't think there was anything, was there?
Well, you wrote about the band leader's composition.
Oh, well, yes, I remember. Oh, yeah, he was, of course, he was a teacher, high school music teacher, and he did that. I don't recall any little theater groups. I'm sure there must have been. There was one in high school. There was a little theater group. I remember that. But when I was growing up, when I was young, say in junior high school and so forth, no, I don't recall. Does anybody else remember if there were arts and crafts and that sort of thing?
Was Martinez Music Forum was around then. Do you remember there were concerts at the Congregational Church?
Oh, but
Which ones?
I must have. Went to Sunday school then. But I don't remember those concerts. No. I don't think they were as culturally inclined then as they seem to be now. You have a lot of things going on now. Although I was reading in one of those Martinez history books with the pictures and all that, in the turn of the century, in the 1920s, that they had theatricals here and they had music, different kinds of chamber music and things like that, which surprised me because I hadn't known that.
What did you study at college?
Art.
Fine art.
Fine art, yeah. It was a double major, fine art and English. And just always knew I wanted to be both. So, yeah, I'll ask you.
I know there was a ferry going to San Francisco. If you didn't have a car, how would you get to Concord? Was there the train or to Oakland? Was there any public transportation?
Oh, you mean during that, in those days? There was, trains certainly went down to Oakland, the one that was, Southern Pacific. And if you wanted to go to Oakland, to Concord and those places, I don't recall that there was a bus. I think you just have to drive there or bicycle there. I'm pretty sure there wasn't a bus then. Yeah, the Berkeley and Oakland you could get to. That's Sacramento.
Are you still an artist?
Helen Maria, I perceived, went to school every day at Berkeley in the earliest part. Later on, she lived on campus.
Yeah.
Was that fictionalized?
Yeah. No, that was true. But at that time, I think she went to Cal 2 or 3 days a week. I don't think it was every day, but no, she really did. She really did take the train down there. Yeah. And then finally, she did move down there.
Was Aegon real?
Yes, he was, but he wasn't as real as he was in the book. Because I met him only once and sort of built him up into an idol in the book, because I didn't really know him very well. But there are other people who were real in the book. Rudy was real, the dachshund, Rudolph.
How about Aunt Dorothy?
Aunt Dorothy was really a figment. Aunt Dorothy never existed. No, yeah, poor Aunt Dorothy.
How about that living room that she supposedly was there?
Yeah, that house was a lovely house, but it was somehow never came together. It always looked as if it were just in the middle of being cleaned or straightened or something and then forgotten about. So it was pretty much like that. And then Udine was pretty real. She was pretty real. And she moved away. I never did know what became of Udine. That wasn't her name. Of course, her name was Ramona, as I remember. So no, I'm glad some of these people did move away long ago. They never read the book. So it was just as well, I think. Yeah.
But their children or grandchildren might have. I understand that it is used in a number of high school English classes.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Classes.
That's true, so you never know. And nowadays, with people, there's computers and Googling and all that, I'm sure all they have to do is to look at a name and then they'll find out, Udine is actually living here and that's her real name. There's no privacy. No way you can keep your privacy nowadays. It will all be common knowledge one of these days, I think.
Is there a movie in the offing?
I tell you, it had such a good start. It was going to be filmed by PBS in Boston, and they had the cast lined up. They had everything, and this was about 15 years ago. And then the man behind it all got a wonderful offer to go to Hollywood, and he just put the whole thing. And that's it. So it's never. I think it'd make a very good, and it's been bought for the movie several times, but nothing's ever come of it. I think it would make a good movie.
I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how many people nowadays, if they saw it in the movie, would be able to put themselves in the place of somebody at that time. What do you think? I don't know.
People, like one lady in the book said, she's a little bit younger than Susie, as
Yeah.
I guess I am, just a little younger than Susie, but so close to what they experienced.
Yeah, well,
And so
I've heard that.
they're
Yes.
still around.
That's true. That's true, and I do think of it. If anything has a certain universality, there's no way. I mean, gosh, look at the movies we see that take place 100 years ago, and we still are able to identify with the characters. So, yeah, I wish somebody would do something with it. Also, Love Out of Season was. Oh, and they did make a movie out of Mrs. Monk. Did you know that? Oh, God. I shudder every time I think of what happened to that poor movie.
Was it, was it called Mrs. Monk?
Yeah, no, what the heck was it called? Was it called Mrs. Monk? I can't even remember. I think it was. Yeah, I think it was called Mrs. Monk. It was a television movie and Diane Ladd played the main role, and Bruce Dern played Mr. Leary, and it was set in Maine, and that's just like Port Costa, you know, north and east coast and all that. And it was silly. It was a very silly, uninspired piece of baloney. So, and that's the only time anything's ever been filmed. You have no say-so once it's taken out of your hands, you know.
So maybe we don't want it.
Well, yeah, that's right. You have to be pretty sure beforehand who it is. Yeah?
Wasn't Mrs. Monk originally bought by Anne Bancroft?
Oh, no, but I know what you're referring to. Anne Bancroft wanted to play Mrs. Monk.
I thought you bought the rights to it.
No, you know why? Yeah, she had read the book, and she got in touch with the person who held the rights, whom I'd sold the rights to. And then he got in touch with me. So I took the plane to New York to meet Anne Bancroft. And we met. Neil Konigsberger was the one who had sold the rights. Not sold, you know, he's like an agent. And then she understood that book so wonderfully. She had read it with such insight. She was a wonderfully intelligent actress. And she said, well, yeah, this is a role I really want to play. And I'll be in, and she was married to you know, what's Mel Brooks, yeah. She said, I'll be in touch with you in a couple of weeks. Well, what happened? She got pregnant. But because it was a very chancy sort of pregnancy, she had to stay in bed for 9 months. And her husband was going to back the movie. You know, got tons of money. It would have been perfect. But then, so it just went down the drain because she had to go get pregnant. So she would have been perfect for the role. Maybe there's another good actress sitting around waiting to play that role. You never know. Is that the thing that's going on?
Well,
Well,
are they
Yeah. I'm so glad you all asked questions, because I would never know where to go from one point to another. And it's nice to have, talk with people who also remember or would like to know what happened in the past.
We have 3 of those books back here. There's 1 Rivers of Peace and 2 River Shadows that Ella would be happy to sign. They're $15 each, we have 3 left. If anybody's interested in, we can have you sign up, and I think she'll really probably give us